Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. I'm your host, Dave Vance. Today's topic is the 10th Amendment and nullification. Our guest is Representative Bud Hulsey of Kingsport, who represents the 2nd District of Tennessee in the legislature. Representative Hulsey carried a nullification bill in the legislature this past session and is a strong advocate of the 10th Amendment and the Constitution. As all legislators should be, unfortunately, many are not. For those of you who are not familiar with the 10th Amendment, let me explain. The 10th is the last amendment in the Bill of Rights. Most people are familiar with the 1st, the 2nd, the 4th, and the 5th, but the 10th, not so much. So just to rehash a little bit, First Amendment is your freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, assembly, petition. Second Amendment is right to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed, by the way. Third Amendment prevents quartering of troops. Fourth Amendment is you can't have your house searched without a warrant. There's guidelines for searches and seizures. Fifth Amendment, right to a jury, prevention of double jeopardy, self-incrimination. Sixth Amendment, jury trial, right to confront and to counsel, right to confront your accuser and to have counsel. Seventh Amendment is common lawsuits and jury trials. Eighth Amendment prevents excessive bails or fines, cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment says that non-enumerated rights are still protected by the Constitution. And then the 10th Amendment, which is the main focus for tonight, is that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So just understand that when our Constitution was written in 1787, when the convention was complete, they had to have the Constitution ratified in order for it to become the Constitution of the United States. They needed at least 9 states out of the 13 to ratify it. Well, even some of the people who were involved in the Constitutional Convention, when it was all said and done, they were very concerned that what they had created would end up being tyrannical, that they maybe had given the federal government too much power. And those people were generally known as the Anti-Federalists. Those who either believed that the Constitution struck the right balance, or many of them just believed they wouldn't get anything any better, were generally referred to as the Federalist. Now, both the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist were publishing articles to either convince people in the states to ratify it or to oppose it. Now, there were some prominent people that were very much against it. George Mason, who was in the Constitutional Convention, when it was all said and done, he opposed it. Patrick Henry, governor of Virginia, Patrick Henry of give me our liberty or give me death, he opposed the Constitution. So there were legitimate concerns, and some people really wanted to start over. Well, James Madison and a lot of others are like, look, we don't want to do this again. We're not convinced we'll get anything better. We may end up with something worse. So some of the people that complained about a lack of the Bill of Rights, basically they wanted it in writing, things the federal government could not do to the people and or to the states. Now, some of those people, legitimately, that was their concern. Others were looking for an excuse to scrap it and start all over again. In any event, it became apparent that if they were going to get this passed, they had to have a Bill of Rights. And so Madison made the promise that if you guys will support this, if you will pass this bill, this Constitution, that in the first session, I will bring up the Bill of Rights, all the issues that have been presented. And he presented, I think, at least 12 items, and then 10 of them that were passed, those are our Bill of Rights. And I tell you all that to remind you that the founders were very concerned, even the Federalists who supported it. And one of their arguments was, if it doesn't say they can do it, they can't do it. Of course, the Anti-Federalists said, we want a little more assurance than your word. We want it in writing. But both sides were concerned with an overly powerful federal government. They just spent 8 years fighting against Britain, and they didn't want to reinstitute what they had just fought against. So that was the reason for the Bill of Rights. Now, like I said, most people are familiar with the others, but the 10th, not so much. And it's important because the Constitution, in addition to having the Bill of Rights, in the main body, it has Article 1, Section 8, and we'll cover that a little bit later in this broadcast. that lays out the specific things, the specific powers that belong only to the federal government. It also lays out some things that the states cannot do specifically, and most of those correspond with the specific powers given to the federal government. All right, and then of course the 10th says, hey, anything not specifically given to the federal government or denied to the states is retained by the states and or the people. So they were very concerned. We did not set up a supreme federal government that gets to dictate. Now, when I say federal government, these restrictions on the federal government, that was not just a restriction on the president, not just a restriction on the legislature, a restriction on the courts as well, okay? So when federal government means all three branches. Think about it for a minute. Does anybody really believe that the founding generation would set something up to where our rights for here on out would be decided by 5-4 Supreme Court decisions? That's what we've had for way too long. And yes, historically we have often deferred to them, but that's not what was laid out by the founders. If you read, matter of fact, I mentioned the Federalist Papers a minute ago, and one of the things that Alexander Hamilton, who was a Federalist, who had opposed adding a Bill of Rights to there, he said that let me find it, I'm sorry. Okay. There's no position which depends on clearer principles than every act of a delegated authority contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised is void. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution can be valid. And that was Alexander Hamilton from Federalist 78. If you read the Federalist Papers, you will find more than one place where they say things that are unconstitutional are void, all right? Matter of fact, there's early Supreme Court decisions that say the same thing. So there's an implied task when they set it up this way. The implied task is that the states are not going to just go along when the federal government overreaches, that they are going to push back. And the notion that they can only push back through the courts, that doesn't pass the smell test. You're not going to just allow a federal branch of the government to determine the authority of the federal government overall in disputes between the states. That cannot be the only avenue. So anyway, I would encourage you to read both the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers to get a better idea of the thought process at the time. So now that we've hit on the top topics there, we're going to go ahead and bring out our guest, Representative Bud Hulsey, to talk about his nullification bill and get his thoughts on 10th Amendment, Supremacy Clause, Article 1, Section 8, and anything else he wants to hit along those lines. Thank you for coming on with us today, Representative Hulsey.
Thank you, Dave. I sure appreciate the chance to spend some time with you, and I appreciate what you do and what you just said. That's incredibly important. I think people in this country for the past 60, 70, 80 in particular years, probably before that too, but we've been conditioned to believe that the ultimate sovereignty is not in the Constitution of the United States, that the Constitution is not supreme, that the federal government's supreme. And we have slowly been conditioned, and that's the way a whole lot of lawyers coming out of law school have been trained in error, I think, to believe the wrong thing. The Constitution is what is supreme. It is not the federal government. And you're exactly right on the 10th Amendment when you understand that there's only about 18 enumerated things that these men wrote in the Constitution that the federal government can even mess around in. Then you do understand how important the 10th Amendment is, because if it's not one of those enumerated things, then it's left up to the power of the people in the states. So it's hugely important.
Absolutely. Can we go ahead and post the Article 1, Section 8 slide there, please? And these may be kind of hard to read for everybody, but I can, I don't know if you're able to see those, Representative Hulsey?
Yeah, okay. I got a list of them right here, actually.
Oh, okay.
The 18 enumerated powers of Congress, like you say, some people say 20, depends on how you count them, but they got a right to tax and spend by the Constitution.
Well, they do that, don't they?
Don't they do it well? They've got to under that is of course the general welfare, and that's one of those phrases that's been perverted by the federal government that opens up the door for a lot of federal power that they don't have. But general, of course, welfare implies that the government can't tax or spend for specific welfare of individuals or regions or social and economic groups. It's for the general welfare of the whole country, of course, and that's been perverted. It's almost been written out of the Constitution. But they can borrow money. They can regulate commerce. That's another one of the clauses that's been perverted and pushed way past beyond what it was supposed to be under the original intent of the framers. But they can regulate commerce with foreign nations, with Indian tribes, and among the states. And like I said, they perverted that to the place where they're down telling the farmer what he can grow and not grow. And the courts have said, well, it affects interstate commerce, and that's how they've opened up that door for that kind of abuse. But then they can make rules for naturalization and bankruptcy. They can coin money and regulate money value, fixed weights and measures. They can punish counterfeiting. They can establish post offices and post roads. They can establish rules for copyrights and patents. They can establish federal courts that are below the Supreme Court. They can define and punish piracy and felonies on the high seas and violations of laws of nations. They can declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal. They can raise and support armies, which is interesting because they had a 2-year limit on funding armies. They didn't like standing armies on our continent, but they liked the Navy.
Right.
To be there year round, but they didn't like what we'd come through with England. They didn't like that. And provide for a Navy. They've got they can do rules of discipline for military forces and a uniform code of military justice. They can provide for calling a state militia into federal service to execute federal laws, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And they can organize.
You mean that they would be repelling the ones they're not leading, like the one they're leading down at the southern border right now?
Yeah. There you go.
Right.
They can organize, arm, and discipline a militia while they're in federal service. They can control the District of Columbia and other federal property, and they can do what? And here's another one that comes at the end of this. The 18th thing, when the phrase necessary and proper to carry out foregoing powers and other powers granted to Congress. But, of course, the framers' mind was what's necessary and proper for these 18 things.
Right.
That's another one that's been abused and perverted to open up a whole lot more federal power than they should have.
Right.
But that's been called the elastic clause sometimes because of that.
Right.
But that's what the federal government can do. That's what the framers gave them the authority to do, enumerated in the Constitution, and then that's why the 10th Amendment comes in and says anything outside these 18 things is left up to the power of the people of the states.
Yeah. And I mentioned the supremacy clause, and that's part of the problem too, or a misunderstanding of the supremacy clause. And I do want to read that real quick because, they ignore that they're limited by those 18 to 20 items, and then a lot of them misinterpret the supremacy clause. And it says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, in pursuance of the Constitution. And all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution and laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. But the key is the Constitution is supreme, not the federal government.
Yeah, and on that note, Dave, what's interesting too is they've perverted a whole lot of that in law schools.
Yes. Because
there's two views of why they said that a treaty under the authority of the United States rather than the authority of the Constitution is, well, one view is treaties are superior to the Constitution, which is dangerous, and they cannot be because if a treaty is superior to the Constitution, that means that that a treaty could amend the Constitution.
Yep.
And
Yep.
that's not what those framers would have ever thought about that. So,
Right.
but I think under the authority of the United States, the common thought is that they intended to honor treaties that were made before the Constitution was adopted. So
right.
that makes pretty good sense to me. But treaties under the framers' idea would never trump the Constitution. The treaty would have to fall under constitutional principle, just like anything else.
Well, it doesn't make sense that we would set up a process for constitutional amendments, which that's a pretty big hoop in this country, yet we would allow that same government to make a treaty with another country or countries, and that change how we operate internally. That just doesn't make sense, doesn't pass the smell test.
Yeah, and it comes back to what you had said before, that the Constitution is what's supreme, not the federal government.
Right. And of course, some of the things that states can't do are kind of, they correspond with that. So, the countries can't go make their own treaties. They can't regulate interstate commerce. Those are the type things that the state can't do. I don't know that we're really going to hit into that a whole lot, but anybody that's interested, Article 1, Section 8 lays out what the specific things the federal government is supposed to do. Article 1, Section 10 outlines the things that states can't do. And if you look, you'll see for the most part they correspond. So what should Representative Hulsey, what should we do when the federal government exceeds its authority? How do we actually put some teeth into the 10th Amendment? What's that process?
Well, that's why I ran a bill this last session. It was entitled an act to restore state sovereignty through the Nullification Act. And the beginning of the bill has all these whereases, but it was important to put them in there to explain exactly what you've explained, that what the intent of the framers were when they wrote the Constitution. And does a state have a right to nullify something that is not law? And it's not law on its face because it's void. And if you read exactly what you said in your beginning remarks, if you read all those boys said, look, if it is not by the Constitution, it's outside the realm of the 18 things that the federal government can mess around in, then it's not law at all. It's void. And so what process do you go through to nullify that? And I found it in the state house down there. When you start talking about these things, most state representatives, I think, don't even think you have a right as a state to nullify federal law. And then I've had other lawyers who say you don't have to write a bill to nullify something. You just ignore it. Writing a bill doesn't give you any more authority to nullify than you have already. And there's a part of that that's true, except the bill that I ran does more than that. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But in our own state government, our state constitution says that all power is inherent in the people. And I think that's a misconception on a lot of people's parts, is that they don't understand that rights were given by God to people before the Constitution was ever written. And the Constitution was written not to govern people. It was written to govern government.
Yes.
And people in elected offices like me. The Constitution was written to bind me down, to bind state legislators down, to bind federal legislators down and federal courts down by what they can and cannot do, specifically regulates the laws that they can pass, the decisions that they can make. And people are to the place in this country now where Biden opened his mouth with an executive order and people treat it like law.
Yeah.
This is kind of a side, but I got sideways with our executive branch of government back during COVID when I was arguing with some other legislators that the governor of the state of Tennessee doesn't have a right constitutionally to tell one business they can stay open and tell another business that they have to close. And there were a couple of legislators that said, "Oh no, he can, because we passed a bill back in 2002, the Emergency Powers Act, that gives him the right to do it. And I said, you cannot do that because constitutionally, the Constitution does not give legislators the power to make legislators out of somebody else.
Absolutely. And on that,
so go ahead.
I do want to say one thing about that real quick. And I intend in the near future to do a show just on the Tennessee Constitution, specifically the Declaration of Rights and then Article 11, Section 16. Our Constitution, right up front, gives you all the things that are rights, and most of them mirror the 10th, the Bill of Rights, plus there's some additional ones. And then later on, in Article 11, Section 16 of our state Constitution, it says that these rights are removed from the general power of the government and shall never be violated under any pretense whatsoever. Any means COVID, means smallpox, means natural disaster, whatever. So you were absolutely right on that, and they were absolutely wrong. No real surprise there.
Yeah, that was a big war, and I ended up running bills trying to offset that. I ran a bill that said you can't use police power to enforce executive orders that deal with, in this particular bill, 3 constitutional issues: the right to move around and travel, the right to assemble and worship, and the right to go to work. Yeah. And because I was worried about exactly what happened, I wasn't really worried so much about our governor doing it. I was worried about mayors doing it. Yeah. Yeah. And turns out, from what I heard, the mayor down there in Nashville had police officers writing citations for people who didn't wear a mask. And those kinds of things, when you start going down unconstitutional roads, then you just have arbitrary power, and executive branches cannot make law. And I had a big fight over that. But anyway, this bill says, of course, that what we talked about, that the Constitution only gives about 18 specific limited powers to the federal government. So what do you do when they overstep that and they operate either with the federal courts trying to make law or people viewing it as law, or the executive order comes out of the president and people view that as law? What do you do about that? You have a right to, under the 10th Amendment, to exercise the state's sovereignty as being superior to the federal government's sovereignty. And that was a big war I got in with some lawyers in the legislature. They didn't like the wording that there wasn't just a horizontal separation of powers, but there's a vertical separation of powers in that the state sovereignty is superior to the federal sovereignty, which makes perfect sense to me because if under our Constitution it says that all the powers inherent in the people and they have a right to abolish or alter government, right? Well, how could your sovereignty not be superior if you have the right to abolish the existing government? Right. Well, you have a right.
And since the federal government only has the enumerated powers, I mean, it's amazing to me that some of these people take an oath to a Constitution that I'm convinced some of them have never read and most of them don't understand, or if they understand, they don't care.
Right. Well, and of course, in the Bill of Rights that you mentioned, in the very First Amendment, Congress was specifically denied lawmaking power within the field listed in that First Amendment. And it's the same thing in the Ninth Amendment that you mentioned. The Ninth Amendment, people had common law rights that were in existence. I think it was Hamilton, I'm not positive, but I think it was Hamilton that was worried that if you only listed these 10 Bill of Rights, that there'd be rights then later that government would pervert that and say, well, if it's not listed, you don't have it.
Absolutely.
And so that's why the Ninth Amendment was added to say, oh, no, all these rights that were in existence before the Constitution was ever written are retained by the people. Yep. And, excuse me, I'm sorry for coughing, I'm fighting something here, but what's interesting about that is we passed a bill. This is just a side stuff, and you can tell me to move on if you want to. But we passed a bill, House Bill 1, down there, and there was the bill that said doctors or medical profession can't cut off healthy body parts off of minors or pump hormones in them or puberty blockers and all this stuff to kids. You can't do that. And And I had an amendment on the House floor that I wanted to add to that bill because Arkansas and Alabama passed the same bill and they both lost. And it was overturned. But I wanted to add the Ninth Amendment common law verbiage in there that a child has a right at common law. And the reason that's so important is because under common law, you couldn't harm a kid by cutting off healthy body parts and interrupting their growth. You couldn't do that. And it is that argument under common law that it seems that the Supreme Court is listening to now, because it was the common law argument in Dobbs that overturned Roe. And so the Ninth Amendment is huge. It hasn't been used a whole lot, and I don't think law schools teach it much, but it's an important thing. But anyway, they were specifically prohibited from interfering with the rights not mentioned in the Constitution. And in the 10th Amendment that you talk about, the federal government was specifically denied powers not delegated to it in the Constitution. So what do you do with this issue when the state sovereignty is superior to the federal government's limited powers and their sovereignty with only the 18 things that they have a right to deal with? What's a state supposed to do about that? Well, you quoted some of those. Here's quotes from other cases. In U.S. 100 U.S. 371, an unconstitutional law is void and is as no law. And this is all in the first part of my bill. An unconstitutional act is not law. It confers no rights. It imposes no duties. It affords no protection. It creates no office. It is in legal contemplation as inoperative as though it had never been passed. That was in Norton versus Shelby County in 1886.
And it doesn't say, even though this was a court decision, it does not say that you have to go to a federal court and get an opinion to determine whether or not it's a violation of the 10th Amendment. It doesn't say that. That's nowhere. And the founders would have never contemplated that. If you think it's illegal, if you think it's unconstitutional, you can go to the federal government and find out if the federal government has exceeded the federal government's authority. That's just insane.
Yeah. No, they would never have contemplated that. Thomas Jefferson said in the Kentucky Resolution of 1798, whensoever the federal government assumes undelegated power, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, they're not one of these 18 things, a nullification of the act is the remedy.
Yep.
That every state has a natural right and duty in cases not within the authority of the Constitution to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of powers by others within their own state boundaries. Now, Jefferson laid it right out there. When the federal government exceeds its authority, when they operate unconstitutionally, and that's all nullification is making the federal government obey the Constitution. That's all it is.
Absolutely.
And so, and Jefferson says you nullify it. That's exactly what you do. So that's what this bill that I tried to run last year, this past session, sets up a template almost on how do you do it.
Right.
What's the process? And that's what the bill deals with. And it says that if any action that is concluded to be ultra virus is the wordage, but it's beyond one's power of authority. That's what that means. That the state then can move into a position to start a process to nullify that.
Right.
Now, in this bill that I have, it can be accomplished in a few different ways. The governor actually could nullify if there was a federal edict or order out of Washington that affected the executive branch of government in Tennessee, and it was blatantly unconstitutional. The governor has a right to issue an executive order nullifying it.
Yeah.
Of course, any member of the General Assembly can introduce a bill of nullification, and any court operating under the authority of the Constitution of Tennessee can render a finding or a holding of nullification in a case which it otherwise has proper venue and jurisdiction. If they're hearing a case and they got a right to hear it, and there's a piece of that case that comes out of Washington or a federal side that's unconstitutional, the court has a right to, under this bill, to nullify it. And then the other part of it that I think is really necessary is this gives an avenue for the people of the state of Tennessee to force the legislature to act on their behalf in nullification. This bill says that if you have any combination of 10 county governments or 10 municipal governments, they can write a letter, 10 of them together, write a letter to the Speaker of the House and ask for a bill of nullification be written dealing with one specific federal government overreach or something out of the federal government's unconstitutional. And that starts a process where the Speaker then has to assign somebody to write the bill that deals with nullifying that particular issue that they want to look at or they want nullified. And in the way the bill's written, you can give that to a committee to haggle over it and wrestle over it and argue both sides of it. But in this bill, it says that a committee cannot kill it.
Good.
It has to go to the House floor, and it has to go to the Senate floor for an up or down vote. Now, there's some time constraints in here, but the bill also allows that to be massaged. If you needed another week or something, you have a right to do it under this bill. But there's another way that people can force the legislature to act, and that's if you have signed petitions of 2,000 registered voters or more in this state. They can submit a petition of nullification to the Speaker of the House, and that kicks the same process in gear again. It forces the Speaker then to assign somebody to run and write and run a bill of nullification dealing with this specific thing that these 2,000 people signed a petition over. And it falls under the same restraints again. You can haggle around it in committee and argue over it all day long, but you cannot kill it. It has to go to the House floor and the Senate floor for a vote.
Let me ask something on that, and on that last one, and we talked about this earlier. And obviously the bill made some progress in the House, and as far as the number of 2,000, I mean, that's something that probably would not end up being, that low of a number probably would not end up being in a final bill. Would you think that's accurate to say, that the number would probably have to be higher?
Actually, there was the first committee that I presented this bill in, there was one legislator who thought that number was too low. And that's not in stone. It doesn't have to be 2,000. It can be more than that.
Right.
That's not a succeed or lose issue.
Right.
You know, I can change that.
Yeah, and I think I said too high. I meant to say too low. Yes, too low.
Yeah. There was one legislator that brought that up, but it went through the House committee. Of course, the governor flagged the bill.
Yeah, surprise.
And didn't like it, and he didn't like it because he worries we're going to lose federal money over it. And of course, you know, I say to legislators, you know, Patrick Henry didn't jump up and say, "Give me money or give me death." You know, good grief. You know, we didn't go to war with King George because he wouldn't bestow money. You know,
right.
That's not what this is about, and we very well may need to come to a place where we begin to wean ourselves off federal money. If you're going to lose your liberty.
Absolutely. I want to back up here just a little bit. On your bill, so your bill is essentially just a process bill. This is how we do it. Now, somebody had mentioned earlier to you that we don't need this. So we don't have to have a bill, and that's accurate. You don't have to, okay? But I'm trying, and I know that the state has, on occasion, taken the federal government to court over 10th Amendment issues. But that I'm aware of, the state has never just said, no, we're not going to do that. Okay, I've never seen them take, and there's been plenty of things they could do it for. There's plenty of things right now they could do it for. I'll give you a perfect example. Yes, the federal government gets to make the decision on illegal immigration. There was a Supreme Court decision years ago that now requires us to pay for the education of all these illegal kids. So that number has increased under Biden's watch, the federally led invasion, obviously it's going to increase. Well, so has our state said, you know what, federal government, we're not going to continue to pay for all of these people that you're putting in our school system, all right? We're not going to do it. Matter of fact, we should just be sending them on up to DC or somewhere up north.
Denver.
Yeah, send them to Denver, that's fine too. But I haven't seen any indication. So I don't think, if you don't have a process in there, and multiple processes to include the one where citizens can push the issue, then I really don't see them doing anything other than an occasional lawsuit. That's all I see the state doing. So I'm glad that you put those processes in there.
Historically, you're exactly right. The mentality is, and it's still the mentality even in the legislature, the general mentality is the only avenue you have for redress if the federal government becomes tyrannical, or the president of the United States becomes tyrannical, which is exactly what he did when he says to the people in Tennessee, any business in Tennessee that has 100 people or more employed by it, you will have this stinking shot whether you like it or not, and you're going to test everybody. Well, good grief. How much more tyrannical do you want before you stand up and say, no, we're not doing that?
Absolutely.
But the idea in the General Assembly is that the only source of redress that you have is the courts.
Yeah.
And that's crazy. That is absolutely crazy. See, what I'm worried about, this bill, I got it through the first committee.
Right.
It was lined up to go to the state government full committee, and I would have got it passed there. I feel confident I would have.
Yeah.
I've been fooled before, but I feel like I would have. But in the meantime, my Senate sponsor, Janice Bowling,
right,
she went in front of the first Senate committee with this bill.
Yep.
And of course, maybe your viewers don't understand the process, but when I stand up in the well to present a bill in front of the committee, the chairman of the committee will say, next up on the calendar is House Bill 736 by Chairman Hulsey. Chairman Hulsey, you're recognized. I pause there for a minute and wait, because I have to get a motion from a committee member to hear the bill and a second to hear the bill before I can present it. If I don't get a motion or a second, the bill dies right there.
Yep.
Now, when Janice Bowling got up in the Senate to present the bill in the first committee on the Senate side, she got a motion and she didn't get a second.
Yeah.
And the bill died. And so that's what happened to this bill, and it's not just that one. She had another one she ran for me dealing with ESG scoring in the state of Tennessee. These two bills were the two most important bills I had, and she didn't even get a second on either one of them.
Yeah.
And if you got viewers that want to get fussy about something and get mad about that, they ought to get mad about that.
Absolutely. And I want to say something about that. That was the day after our lieutenant our lieutenant governor, Randy McNally, had gotten, he did an internal straw poll because he basically got busted having, I guess you could say, an improper online relationship with a known young homosexual guy. Now, Randy McNally's like 79 years old, and I guess and as far as I know, everything's just online. I don't know that they did anything beyond that, but it was a disgrace to our state. I mean, Saturday Night Live was laughing at us. Okay, so there was a problem, and there were some people that were concerned. McNally tried to cut it off by doing an internal poll. Now, the names of the people who voted against keeping McNally in office, there was only 7 out of 20-some Republican senators that said, hey, this guy needs to go, in addition to it being known that he's kind of like the Joe Biden of Tennessee in terms of his mental competency, from everything I understand from legislators and other people that are up there. Yet they decided to keep him. Well, my understanding and my guess would be that Bowling probably was one of those who voted against him. And it seems, and we know that these kind of things happen. We know that if the leadership, whether it be McNally or Sexton, and McNally's got a very bad reputation for doing this, If he doesn't want the bill to pass, whether it's a personal animus against the sponsor or whatever, it won't get a second. It'd be lucky to get a motion. And I think that's what happened.
Well, I don't know. I just know both of those bills failed because of that. And Lieutenant Governor got a great deal of power, and so does Speaker of the House. I mean, they do.
Yep.
They have a great deal of power. I really don't know, but I know that the two most important bills that I had this year, they both failed in the Senate, and it was for that reason. They didn't get a second.
Yep.
Which brings me back around to this, because if I can't get this bill passed, and I'm going to run it again next session, but if I can't get it passed in the meantime, Dave, there is so much evil out here coming against this country and against this state that it scares me, and it troubles me at nighttime when I lay down and to go to sleep. These things swirl around my head on what can I do, what can we do as a legislature to lay planks in place to protect Tennessee people's sovereignty when these things get here, and just like a central bank digital currency. Been working on this for a while to try to lay planks in place to protect Tennessee people's sovereignty and security, and another big thing is, if you listen to what Schwab says, and the World Economic Forum, and the international health regulations that are coming out, and what they want to do, they want us to cede state sovereignty and United States sovereignty to a health organization who can dictate exactly what you're going to do and what you cannot do the next virus that comes along, or anything else that they want to claim is a health issue, climate change, anything. And so I've got to run. I'm going to try and draft a single bill, just dealing with a bill of nullification that nullifies any existing or any rules in the future that come out of the World Health Organization or the international health regulations that take away the sovereignty of the state of Tennessee.
Good.
Because I'm afraid if I can't get this bill passed, we got to do something to protect Tennessee sovereignty.
Yeah. And so we don't have to protect it just from our federal government. We have to protect it from international organizations that our federal government, whether it's through a treaty or not, they go along with. Oh yeah, we're going to do this, and we have no defense otherwise.
And see, that's why when we talked about the issue over the supremacy clause on treaties, because the Senate has not ratified this treaty that Biden put us back in, that Trump got us out of, and Biden turned and put us right back in there. But there's been no vote by the Senate at all on that treaty. That's just Biden doing it. And if you don't stop that, I mean, we will lose our sovereignty. You look at Agenda 21. It's Agenda, what is it, 2030 now?
Yep.
Most people are asleep, and sleep always precedes tyranny, always.
Absolutely.
And people are asleep, not understanding that we can lose it all. Their goal, and they say this unashamedly, their goal is to take 75% of the land mass in the United States, and it will have no human footprint on it. You will herd everybody into metropolitan areas, and they will have complete control of 75% of this land. You won't do anything on it. And I've said for a long time, even all the way back to Clinton, when he talks about a sustainable environment, what that means is the loss of private property is what that means. And
absolutely,
this stuff's coming. I mean, it's coming, and we better. I'm just being candid with you, Dave. This is my heart. If we're going to salvage this republic, to me, the only way I know to do it is it needs two things. It needs a revival in a church for truth, And it needs state legislatures to stand up and say to the federal government, we're going to hold you to the Constitution, period.
Absolutely.
No more.
Divine intervention and state intervention. That's the only, DC is not going to fix DC. The upcoming election, yes, I'd like to see Donald Trump get elected again. I'm not going to assume that we'll have a fair election, but even if he does, that is not going to fix all of our problems. The problems are too deep. Like I said, divine intervention and state intervention, the only thing that's the only possible way to restore our government, because DC will not fix DC. Now, you talked about money a minute ago, and trying to get these kind of bills through, it always comes back to, well, federal funding. Our representatives they just seem like they think there's no way around us being bribed with our own money to do things that we otherwise wouldn't do. And so do you think, what's the best way to break that addiction? Because I think that's one of the things we have to do in our state, is break that addiction.
I agree with you. Actually, Speaker Sexton came out, with a pretty strong statement about that in the education side. Maybe we need to start looking at cutting back on federal money. We're one of the most prosperous states in the United States, and it's because we've laid a groundwork for that kind of liberty to prosper here, and if we have to get used to cutting and weaning ourselves off of it, then that's what we ought to do.
Absolutely. Education would be a good place to start.
It sure would, and if you understand too the 18 enumerated things that the federal government can only mess around with, then you understand there should be no Department of Labor, there should be no Department of Education, there should be no Department of Commerce. For crying out loud, you wouldn't have all that mess.
Absolutely. They bring this up, so just what we've said, it sounds like it's a long shot, although you did have success in the House. But you're basically proposing a process, believe it or not, for something that the majority in the Senate and the majority in the House already said they believe in. If we could get the SJR 9005 slide to pop up, we'll go over this. Now, back in October of 21, in one of the special sessions, all this had to do with COVID, okay? But if you look at the wording, and this I'm going to read some of this because this was sponsored by Sexton in the House, McNally in the Senate, believe it or not. And there's maybe one or two Republicans that voted against it. Of course, all the Democrats opposed it, but we expect that. All right, so remember, this all had to do with COVID, but it applies to any overreach by the federal government. And so these are just, I guess you say, some of the actions or some of the key phrases that they passed. And it says, federalism serves to grant and delimit the prerogative and responsibilities of the states and the national government, to serve the integrity, dignity, and residual sovereignty of the state, and there's something blocking that, I can't see that. Anyway, states function as political entities in their own right. It also says that if federal government exceeds its lawful powers, liberty is at stake. The court acknowledged that a government's police power is a general power of governing possessed by the states and not the federal government. The Constitution's express conferral of some powers to the federal government makes clear that it does not grant a federal government, that the federal government can't exercise anything else. And I'm having to paraphrase these. There's some things I'm having trouble seeing here. Complete jurisdiction over the concerns of public life. Federalism protects the liberty of the individual from federal power. And assertions of federal power must be grounded in some constitutional grant and power. Each member of the General Assembly has taken an oath to uphold the Constitution and the Constitution of the United States. You guys, and you're doing your best, but the state representatives and state senators are the last line of political defense in our country. And same thing across for every other. You're the last line of political defense between us and the federal government. And, if the 10th fails, if we don't utilize the 10th, if we continue not to utilize the 10th, that only leaves the 2nd. Okay, it will be the 10th, the 2nd, or total tyranny. That's what we'll end up with. Those are your three options. The thing is, the state government, both the House and the Senate, and like I say, that was 21. We've got most of the same people still there. They said they believe what you believe. All you've done is give them processes to do it. So for them not to jump all over that, we have to wonder if they really meant what they said. But they have said it. It's on record.
Yep. And by the way, nullification is not a new thing.
No.
You have about 40 different federal laws already on the books from the federal government that deal with growing marijuana, smoking marijuana, selling marijuana, transporting marijuana, and all the conspiracy charges that go with it. There's about 40 different laws dealing with it on the federal books already.
Right.
And 22 states in one form or another have stood up and said to the federal government, we're nullifying that. We're going to grow it. We're going to sell it. We're going to smoke it. We're going to tax it. And it nullified federal law, not just a court decision, not just an executive order. They nullified federal law. So, you know, and I'm not saying I agree with that in that particular case. I'm just saying that nullification is not something that's never happened before, or it's not something that's new. But what you just said is we took that position in that resolution that we were willing to nullify overreach from the federal government. Right. And yeah, you would think that we've already taken the position that then this bill would not be an issue, because all this does is define or allow a template to be set in here where there's other means and other ways where the state can be involved in it and set it in motion to nullify.
So you're going to bring it back next year, and of course we want everybody, you know, we have to educate the public on this between now and then as much as possible. And so obviously you're going to want support for this. You're going to need people to call in when it goes to the different committees, and whoever sponsors it in the Senate, Senator Bowling or whoever, they're going to need the same thing, because you mentioned earlier the committee system. And for those of you who don't really follow state politics, bills live or die in committee. If it makes it to the floor, it's very rare that it doesn't pass. All right, so bills live or die in committee. And so we need people to understand that. We need people to understand the issue, and we need them to reach out. You know what has to happen, in my opinion, for this to be successful? If you're a conservative, if you claim to be a conservative Republican in Tennessee, generally speaking, you have to say, well, whether you actually do anything to prove it once you're in office, normally to get elected, you have to say that you're pro-life, that you're pro-Second Amendment, and that you're for strong borders and you're against illegal immigration. You have to say at least, well, we have to make sure one thing is added. We have to make sure I'm pro-10th Amendment and I support nullification. That has to become one of those things that you believe in order to get elected in Tennessee. That's my thought.
Yeah. Well, if we're going to survive, we can't ignore this anymore. I mean, and you're right. You're exactly right. What avenues are left to secure the sovereignty of an individual in the state of Tennessee? This is all that's left.
Absolutely.
Until you have just a complete riot. I mean, this is all that's left.
Now, I want to, on that note, since you're going to bring this up, you're going to need support. And we've already talked about this, but I want to let everybody out there know. Myself, Representative Hulsey, there's a lady named Karen Bracken from East Tennessee, very smart lady. She's very well versed on a lot of different topics. Anyway, she's the founder of an organization. I'm the co-founder of the Tennessee Citizens for State Sovereignty. Representative Hulsey is our first legislative member. We're going to reach out and try to get some more. We have some well-known experts on the Constitution. Publius Hulda, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, I apologize. Jeff Cobble, and we are in talks with some others to join our organization. And you can find the organization at tncss@weebly.com, and you can sign up for a Substack newsletter. We're not asking for money. All we need you to do right now is sign up, read the articles, get the articles sent to you. There's good information on the website about 10th Amendment, nullification, Article 1, Section 8, and there'll be other things added. Now understand this website's under construction. We're not finished with everything, and I'm sure there'll be some things modified. But we need everybody to sign up, because we need to build a good list of people on there, so the more people we have, the more attention the legislature has to pay to us once the legislature's in session. We need people to start talking about the 10th Amendment, nullification, and making it clear to our elected state officials, this is what we expect. You are our last line. You took the oath. Nobody forced you to run. You took the oath. Your oath is both to the state and the U.S. Constitution. And you are that final line, the final political line of defense. And so we need to stress that. So I encourage you to go to tncss@weebly.com. Look under, there's also a link on there for Substack. That's how you will get notified of everything. Not asking for money. Sign up, get yourself educated, share it. And I'm sure we will try to have some events before the next session. And as I said, we're going to try to get more legislators involved. Representative Hulsey, is there anything else that you wanted to say?
I was just going to say, when this comes up again, and people, like I said, people have to pay attention now. They didn't used to have to do this. But you can't afford to be ignorant anymore. You can't afford to ignore or be sleepy or not get involved if you want to stay free. I mean, that we're down to that. So when this bill comes up, you need to look on. You can go to Tennessee General Assembly website. You can get the bill number, and you can track where it's going, and it will tell you what committee it's coming up in, and when, and what you need to do is reach out to those committee members that are going to hear this bill, and give them a letter or give them an email or go visit them or give them a phone call or go see them. Write a letter and say, I expect you, or please protect my sovereignty and my liberty by voting for this bill. And that's when legislators hear, particularly from constituents in their district, they listen, and don't send an email that's 14 paragraphs long, because nobody gets time to read it. And I get some of those, and I'm just telling you, when we're in session, I get between 180 and 250 emails a day. Now, a lot of that's junk that I can weed out, a lot of stuff from the government that I've got to read, state government. But I try to answer every email I get, and when I get an email that's 14 paragraphs long, I just don't have time to read it. So make it as concise as possible, but you look and follow where this bill's going and contact those legislators on that committee that's going to hear it.
And I do have one last question for you, and it's not related per se to the 10th Amendment or the U.S. Constitution, but our governor has decided that we're going to have I call it the special session for official oppression, also known as red flag law. We're going to have a special session for that. And I think I know where you stand, but I'd kind of like to hear your thoughts on that one.
Well, I swore, just like you said. I raised my hand on that House floor along with 99 other members, and I swore to 7 million people in the state of Tennessee, that I would always protect their unalienable rights by defending the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the state of Tennessee. Well, the Constitution of the United States, under the Fourth Amendment that you just mentioned, says that people have a right to be protected from unreasonable searches and seizures. When police kick your door in and steal your property, and listen, I was police for 36 years. You cannot do that, and you can't do it without a warrant, and you can't get a warrant because you have broke no law.
Right.
That violates the Fourth Amendment. So I will not do anything or vote for anything that violates the Fourth Amendment or the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the state of Tennessee. Yeah. Now, I wish the governor wouldn't do it, and I have voiced my opinion. I wished he wouldn't do that, because this could end up being a really a bad thing. And I'm telling you, we already have. I've already heard people snuck into meetings that the left is already shaping up and training people to show up down there and how to cause chaos. And by the way, some of them are armed.
Yes, they are. Yes,
some of them are armed, and you get 800 to 1,000 anti-gunners down there, and you get some good old 600-700 of good old pro-gun boys down there. And listen, you're setting a keg in motion that can cause some real problems. And I wished he wouldn't do it. I can't refuse to go because the Constitution of Tennessee says I have to go.
Now, on that note, it says you have to go because the governor can call it. All right, but like I mentioned a little while ago, you've got our Declaration of Rights up front. which Article 26, excuse me, Section 26 is our equivalent of the Second Amendment. And then Article 11, Section 16, which says that these rights are exempt from the power of the general government and will never be violated no matter what. So there's nothing, if you have this session, there's nothing he can do concerning guns that is that's not a violation of our Constitution, in addition to the Second Amendment. So
Yeah.
you know, and he's only talking about the guns. He's not talking about taking driver's license from crazy people. He's just talking, it's all about the guns.
Well, I think too I think I think the governor is making the risk the wrong thing. The gun is not the risk. If you lay an AR-15 out there and you lay a 9mm that holds 15 rounds, and you lay a 45 Glock out there that holds 15 rounds, and you got 5 clips with 15 rounds in it, and you got a hammer and a chainsaw.
Right.
The risk is not those weapons.
It's the person.
The risk is the person.
Yeah.
So, to me, you need a system to deal with the risk, and of course the ACLU was successful in closing all the mental institutions we had in this state. And
I think that's where all the transgenders came from, right?
Yeah, well, we gotta have, you gotta have some place to deal with the risk.
Right, absolutely.
And so I will not support or vote anything that violates the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the State of Tennessee.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that. I had to ask that, because I mean, until this thing is over, you know, we got to talk to everybody about that. I've got something else on that, but I will get with you about that offline. Hey, thank you very much for your time. Great information. Look forward to working with you on this, getting more people to work with us on the project to not only get this law passed that gives us a process to do nullification, but also to, you know, have people constantly watching. You know, we have organizations across the state, that Tennessee Firearms Association, we focus on our Second Amendment rights and our Section 26 rights for our state. And we have people that focus on what's going on in the schools and the pro-life people and other, but you know, we need a group that focuses on 10th Amendment. So I think that's really important, and I'm looking forward to working with you. I appreciate you coming on. Thank you for your time. We'll certainly have you back. And everybody, I appreciate you being here tonight. If you liked it, like us on Facebook, subscribe. And next week, my guest will be Representative Jay Reedy, and we'll talk about some of the legislation that he got passed this year. Thanks again. See you next week.